Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about the idea of what I'll call easy virtue, or substituting easy virtue for hard virtue. And what put me in mind of this was the gospel reading from Mass this week, which was from the 7th chapter of Mark, in which the Pharisees and scribes saw that some of the disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is to say, without having gone through a ritual purification of their hands. And so, and they asked about this, and this is where Jesus said that it's not what goes into a man that defiles him, but what comes out of him, because what comes out of him are things like adultery and licentiousness and dishonesty and so on. And so, there's so much to say about ritual purity, but I don't want to talk about ritual purity specifically because we don't understand ritual purity very well. We still have things analogous to ritual purity. We have things that basically are ritual purity, but we don't think of them as ritual purity, and so it's kind of a complicated subject in the modern world. That said, we do have, and what we can see fairly well, is what I'll call the concept of easy virtue. And so ritual purity is a good example of a relatively easy virtue. It's not hard to go through the ritual of, washing your hands in a particular way. And these things would always involve, you need to do it in a particular way. You do this, and then you pour the water over, and then you dry them. Sometimes it can be very specific in exactly how you do it. You rinse them 3 times or something like that. You have to get from at least here down or at least here down or what have you. It varies with time and place and culture. But what they all have in common, and this is the thing that I'd like to generalize, is they require some effort. Not a lot, but some effort. And as a result, they require at least a little bit of willpower and a little bit of self-denial. So they have the characteristics of virtue in that you have to exercise your will to choose something even though it's less convenient in the moment, and exercise some amount of self-denial. The thing is, in general, the things I'm talking about is generally not very much. So another interesting example that you'll see, and I've certainly seen, is that of recycling. Now, it can be good to recycle. I'm not saying that recycling is inherently bad. It varies considerably what exactly you're recycling and where and what the setup is. Lots of things that are putatively recycled actually end up getting thrown out or end up being worse than just starting afresh. Paper is often one of those examples. Without getting into the details, there are places where virgin paper, i.e. trees that are grown in tree farms, are actually better overall. They're less energy intensive and so on. You just have your different plots of trees and they grow big enough and you harvest them and then replant and, have a 20-year cycle or something like that. That this could actually be better than recycling the paper because of all the nasty bleaches and stuff you have to use on paper that's already been colored and had print on it and so on. So, leaving that aside though, I just want to acknowledge that they're recycling like glasses and so on that can be very valuable. There's recycling that's much more iffy. So I just want to acknowledge that for anyone who wants to yell about recycling, or who would be distracted by that, rather. That said, just consider the more virtuous kinds of recycling. The thing is, they're still not, very virtuous on the part of the person doing them. It's slightly better for, something that's nice and easy to recycle like glass to recycle that, or metals are another really good example. To recycle that rather than to throw them out, but it doesn't take much effort. It's not a lot. It's not a big thing. But, just to run through a few other examples to make it really clear what I'm talking about. Getting specific sorts of exercises can easily become like this. Where, when people have, essentially exercise rituals, it is very good to take care of your body in the form of exercising. But people can take this to sort of a different level where it takes on a moral overtone. And I mean, there is a moral component to taking care of your body and keeping yourself in good shape. But that said, where the individual workouts can become sort of a moral thing. And moreover, where there's a moral significance attached to the very particular kind of workout that's done. That's one. Another type of thing is eating or not eating certain foods. You can see that and I'm not talking about penitential exercises like fasting during Lent or something like that. But rather, not eating genetically modified organisms. For some people, it's a choice. For some people, it has more of a sort of ritual, moral overtone to it. Eating organic things is an example. For a lot of people, there's not eating meat, not eating animal products, and so on. Like these can, have moral overtones in the thinking of some people who do them. You can find this sort of thing, how people drive, for some people taking public transportation, bicycling to work. There are lots and lots of these things that if you look at them overall, driving a bit more fuel efficient vehicle, when you look at them, sometimes they're bigger, sometimes they're smaller, but what they all sort of have in common is they are, if you're realistic about it, relatively easy to do. They're more work than not doing them, but they're not a lot more work than not doing them. And here's sort of the interesting thing about this, because there are two possible ways of doing things that are virtuous, but only a little virtuous. And one of them is actually good, and the other is actually, can be very detrimental. The good version, which I'll get out of the way quickly, is basically when a person is trying to recover from doing pretty much nothing well. Large steps can be such a change that it becomes a shock and then they just revert. So that for people who have completely fallen away from any virtuous habits, small little steps, just little things can be a building block towards, more. So this especially comes about because those small self-denials involved in small amounts of virtue can seem very large to a person who is completely unused to any form of self-denial. And so this can become a building block where you acclimate yourself to self-denial and to willpower on small things and then build. And then eventually you build up to, much bigger things, much more important things than the things that require, small sacrifices. That's the good sort. It's kind of specific to people you might loosely describe as in recovery or in training. And it's very analogous, actually, by the way, to in exercise when you start off with lifting very small weights if you're weightlifting or running short distances if you're running, and you get used to it and you build on that. So, as a beginning, this can have utility. However, where this becomes a problem is that it can easily become a substitute, especially if a person fills their time with a lot of these things, where several of these put together still don't amount to very much virtue, but they do amount to a fair amount of attention paid to them. This is something Chesterton said. I remember he talked about how the aristocracy in his time, the early 1900s, was really into waking up early and bathing frequently. He said because, as they're very trivial virtues, but he described it as these are much easier than giving the English people back their land. Kind of a complicated economical history in there that I won't get into. But just because of all the things that came later, don't anyone take that to be about things like communism, socialism versus capitalism. It's specific to the feudal history of England up to that time period and not applicable to the modern time. Anyway, but the key there is that thing about that it's much easier to do the small virtues of waking up early every day and bathing frequently than it is to do the larger virtue of giving people what you owe them. And that sort of thing is what enables that. The mechanism behind it, and that's really what I want to get to, is that the amount of time you put into something corresponds to some degree to your perception of how much effort you've put into it. So if you spend a lot of time doing fairly easy things, you will actually think of yourself as having done something fairly hard, unless you pay a lot of attention and are very careful. But our natural drift is to roughly correlate the amount of time you put into something and the amount of effort you've put into something. And it's also very natural to correlate the amount of effort you've put into something with the amount of results you get out of it. So if you spend a lot of time doing really simple things like, making sure that you get a green vegetable in every meal, making sure that you don't eat, that you only eat cage-free eggs, making sure that you, that you do yoga or Pilates or, whatever your thing is, and making sure that you recycle, you'll end up spending, especially anything like the recycling one, by the way, where there aren't like particular times for it, but it can come up at almost any time. You can then spend a lot of time thinking about it, even if most of the time it's irrelevant, you're not doing anything with it. They're checking, is this something I should recycle or throw out? Using that example, every time, even if it's, oh, this is something I should throw out, a lot of places have limits on what you can recycle, for example. So you have to become somewhat familiar with, you can recycle milk cartons, but you can't recycle egg cartons, or, you can't recycle pizza boxes, or you can't recycle milk cartons, but you can recycle pizza boxes depending on your location. Becoming familiar with that and having to, for every item you do something with, whether throw it out or in recycling, think about it means you spend a bunch of time doing this. And every time you spend time doing it, it's a bit of time you are spending on what is, technically speaking, virtuous action. And so you can come to think of yourself as putting a lot of time and sort of, therefore, effort into being virtuous. The problem being, you've done very, very little in the way of virtue. You've done only some very easy things. But it's very easy to let yourself off the hook for much harder things because of all the time you put into very easy things. Because it takes practice, it takes a lot of introspection and a lot of honesty to be realistic about how much effort was actually involved in something that took you a bunch of time to do. You can see the same thing, by the way. Same problem really, frankly, comes up in people who think themselves educated because they went to college. They put a lot of time into it. Some people learned a lot. Some people learned very little. But they all put a lot of time in, and it's very easy for the people who learned very little to think of themselves as having learned a lot or being very well educated simply because they put a lot of time into their education. It's sort of a universal human problem. It's very easy if you put a lot of time into something that you're not really, doing very well, you nonetheless will think of yourself as doing a pretty large amount, even if the actual amount that you've done is fairly small. So it's just a normal human trap. And so this is one of the things that you can get from the scripture passage. One of the things that Christ was bringing up is this, that it's very easy to kid yourself about how virtuous you're actually being. And so this is where these sorts of little virtues can become the enemy, really, of bigger virtues if they displace them. If they displace them in time and effort and energy, because we have a finite amount of energy. I mean, ironically, we get more the more we exercise we get more willpower the more we exercise our willpower, but that's a long-term thing. In the immediate term, an exercise of willpower, weakens you in the short term, just as doing a workout weakens you in the short term. If you go to the gym, lift a bunch of weights, you're not going to be as strong immediately afterwards. And the same thing is true of willpower. You'll be stronger overall. Long term, you will become stronger as you habituate to the thing. But in the short term, you don't. And so it's something to be careful of in all of our attempts to be virtuous, is to be highly realistic about how virtuous each activity is, and whether or not this is, in the big picture of how we live our lives, actually helping us to be overall more virtuous, or is this becoming like a virtue substitute? A little bit analogous to the technical term for them is non-nutritive sweeteners. Things like sucralose and acesulfame potassium and aspartame. Funny thing about them is that they're sugars. They're sugar-like things that will have a very small number of calories, but the curious thing is they'll be much, much, much sweeter than sugar. Acesulfame potassium is, I think, 200 and something times as sweet as sugar per gram. Sucralose is 600 times as sweet as sugar per gram. And so, despite the fact that sucralose has calories in it, we think of them as 0-calorie sweeteners because being 600 times sweeter than sugar, you put in 1/600th as much sugar, and the thing is 1/600th as much sugar is going to be very, very, very little of the stuff, and so it has no real appreciable calories to it. And so you kind of have to be wary of, in trying to live virtuously, is things that are to virtue what sucralose is to sugar. It's an unfortunate metaphor because sugar is probably something you shouldn't have in your diet, whereas virtue is something you very much should have in your life. But nonetheless, the relationship works out really well. You want to be careful of things that feel very virtuous but aren't, and that take up a lot of your sort of energy for being virtuous, because they might displace actual virtue. So that's really, I think, wraps up the topic. That it's a little more general than I was hoping for, but hopefully I gave enough specifics along the way that you can see the basic gist, and sort of the thing to watch out for is to be very realistic and very honest in your assessment for each virtuous action that you're trying to do, of how virtuous actually is it and how much energy are you putting into this. And the key thing being looking at your life as a whole. Do you have that energy to spare for this small thing because you are in fact getting all the big things, or would you be more virtuous overall if you left off a few small things and instead concentrated on the bigger things? The things like, reconciling with a family member you've always been fighting with, which is really hard. It can be very painful. It requires a lot of discipline, a lot of willingness to self-sacrifice. Are you putting something like that off because, you're feeling fairly good about yourself from doing relatively trivial things like recycling, getting a green vegetable, and eating cage-free eggs? Now, I don't mean that. It's an example. It's an example I came up with on the spot. So it's not, a great example, and I'm not saying that people always do this, or that anybody who is, eating cage-free eggs or something like that must therefore be lacking in significant virtue. It's an example of how you can go wrong, and the sort of thing to look out for. So, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at,